In Daniel chapter 8, Daniel takes us to the end of days, to a far future, to the day of judgment, the day of atonement. After a long period, the tribulation, the persecution by the little horn will finally end. Judgment will take place. The chapter mentions a transgression, a crime, a rebellion, depending on translation. Whose transgression is it? Is it only the transgression of the little horn? In that case, why should the answer to the question in verses 13 and 14 deal with the sins of the people of God? Welcome to the second part of Tidbits from Daniel chapter 8. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and we have questions. This is the first one we raise. It is important. Other questions may be of less importance. The term that is used, reading now, for instance, from the New International Version in verse 12, because of rebellion, the host, that is the army of the saints, and the daily sacrifice were given over to it, that is the little horn. The term that is used for rebellion, which pops up again in verse 13 in the question, the rebellion that causes desolation. Is that the rebellion of the people as indicated by NIV, New King James, New American Standard Version and other new translations, or is it the crime of the little horn? I disagree with some of my good friends on this particular topic, so let me be a little heretical. I think that New International Version, New King James, are absolutely right here. When you look at the term that is used, pesha, I acknowledge the two different ways it could be translated in verse 12 and in verse 13. But when you look at verse 23, you find at least one hint that there is support for the translation of the New International Version. This is part of Gabriel's explanation. You remember that he would explain the various elements of the vision. He explains Medo-Persian, the ram. He explains Greece, the goat. In verses 23 to 25, he expands on and explains more about the little horn power. And in verse 23 he says, in the latter part of their reign, that is referring to the Greek Empire, when rebels have become completely wicked. The term that is here used, translated now as a personal reference to rebels, could also be translated, depending on vocalization, as the rebellion, the sins. This is the same term, from pesha. In other words, Gabriel is using here one of the terms which is explicitly mentioned in the vision, and he explains. And it is fairly evident from verse 23 that it does not refer to the rebellion or to the crime of the little horn. This is something rather that causes the little horn to take over. In the beginning of the book of Daniel, you have a phrase, typically Old Testament phrase, the Lord gave the king of Judah into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Whenever you have such a phrase, you would, with the book of Judges and Jeremiah as a background, say, this refers to the sin of the people. They were taken into captivity because of their apostasy. And this phrase, giving into the hand of, has just been used in Aramaic in 725, when it is said here about the tribulation of the little horn, that the saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and a half time. The similar expression Now here you have the giving over in Daniel 8:12. You also have because of transgression, as translated by NIV. It could be in the sphere of transgression referring to the little horn, but it is far from illogical to take it in this context to refer to the cause for the tribulation, just like the apostasy of the people was a cause for various people groups in the time of the judges to attack and take over and bring tribulation of the people of God. As you move on in the book of Daniel and come to chapter 9, you have the same word, pesha, used in verse 24, and definitely it is not there a reference to the crime by the little horn. It is a reference to the general sin and apostasy of the people of God. The sin that Jesus Christ came to remove by making atonement on the cross once and for all. So in the context of Daniel 7, also Daniel 8 would emphasize both the sins of the enemies and the apostasy of the people. Just like there is a judgment of the people that attack. In chapter 7 there was a judgment said in favor of those who belong to the Son of Man. Here you have, when you speak about the sanctuary, you have a reference to how God will cleanse the sins of the enemy and of the people. As in all Hebrew legal system in the background of the time, you cannot judge the enemy unless you justify the people. You cannot justify the people unless you judge the enemy. Those two aspects always in a Hebrew court would go together. So they do in Daniel 8, and so they do on the day of atonement or day of judgment in the time of the end. Let's take a couple of other questions. This was a major one, at least to me. One of the phrases that sometimes confuses people is the term daily sacrifice. Some scholars take this to refer in specific to the daily sacrifice that was brought twice in the Hebrew sanctuary, morning and evening. And they argue that the evening and mornings should then be divided into two, so it's not 2,300, but it is 2 per day, that is 1150. First, that is founded on nothingness. Whenever the daily sacrifice is mentioned in the Old Testament, the sequence is always, without exception, morning, evening. That's not the case here. It's evening, morning, like in the days of creation. But next, when the word tamid, which is used here, is employed in the Old Testament, it is never ever employed exclusively for the daily sacrifice. It is referring or used 13 times in connection with the sanctuary. 5 of these is in connection with the daily sacrifice, and in that case you always have the word for sacrifice, olat tamid. 4 times it is used in reference to the lampstand, and then it's used in reference to the grain offering, and so on. It is simply used in general about the continuous daily service in the temple or in the tabernacle. It is not in specific the daily sacrifice. The attack of the little horn is on the continuous priestly service of Jesus Christ. Let me take a few other questions. When it is said, how long is the vision? It is easy to think this is the vision about the latter part of what is described in the previous However, grammatically that is hardly feasible. The vision covers also Medo-Persia, Greece, and the Little Horn. That means it covers a period of several centuries at least, which indicates that the 2,300 evenings and mornings cannot be read as literal. It has to have some symbolic value. And then to the end of the chapter. In chapter 8, verse 26, Gabriel concludes his explanation to Daniel by saying, "The visions of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future." In the chapter, you have two words for vision. From a lexical point, they could be interchangeable, but in the context, chazon is used, as we can see from verses 1, 2, and 3, and verse 15. Chazon is used in particular about what he sees, Medo-Persian, that is the ram, the goat, Greece, the little horn, and so on. It is used about his visionary experience as such, in totality. Mare is used when there is a personal appearance, in this case by an angel by Gabriel, explaining the elements to Daniel. And this explanation has now taken place. From verse 20 and onwards, Gabriel explains to Daniel what is Medo-Persia, what is Greece. He expands in detail on the third element, the little horn, the fourth empire in the previous vision. And then when he comes to the conversation, his answer is like a non-answer. The vision of the evenings and mornings is true, but... And then he's asked to seal up the whole vision, chazon. So Daniel does not get in a further explanation of the visions about the evenings and the mornings. And in Hebrew, there is even a note that more specifically refers this back to the time period. Because the word Amah, here Nema, of which they were spoken, is used, referring specifically to that part of the vision which was a conversation, the audition, in verses 13 and 14. So here Daniel is at the end of his vision. Gabriel has explained to him the first three elements, the ram, the goat, and the little horn. As Gabriel comes to the fourth element, the time period, he stops his explanation, and Daniel is left to wonder. He did not understand. Will he ever understand? Is there any more explanation given? And the answer is yes, there is. It follows in chapter 9, and that will follow in the next tidbit, or the next tidbits from Daniel 9. Thank you for listening so far to tidbits from Daniel 8, first and second part, and welcome back.